In order to understand what was going on in the housing cooperative movement at this time, the larger co-op movement and the socio-political and socio-economic forces of the time must be explained. The Vietnam War protest movement, coupled with the environmental, the women's, the civil rights, and the New Left movements, were radicalizing the American population, in particular the middle-class students. The middle class, who had had it so good throughout the 50s and most of the 60s, were now being forced by their government to put their lives or those of loved ones at risk in Vietnam. Learning the reality of the stupidity of U.S. foreign policy radicalized them. This had a profound effect on the real estate market in Madison. Not only were male students being sent off to war, but students in general were rejecting traditional middle and upper class American institutions such as fraternities and sororities. As a result, the Greek system in Madison was falling apart, and national fraternities and sororities were on the verge of bankruptcy. Their only options were to sell their houses or rent them to other groups. The Langdon neighborhood was turning into a slum as houses were abandoned right and left. Greedy landlords were moving in to buy up the houses and divide them into tiny overpriced efficiencies. Alternatively, though, co-op-minded students were stepping in to turn the fraternity houses into co-ops. By the early 70s, there were huge waiting lists to get into houses such as Stone Manor, and twice as many people, about 60, were crammed into the house as there are now.
When Stone Manor first started, every room had 2 people in it, whether it was a small room or a large room. And within a year or so, some of the smaller rooms were converted to singles, but there were still a lot of people there. And that was sort of a hotbed of political activism. Most everybody was involved. There was the drug culture was there. It was part of the whole alternative community pretty much, so it was a lot of exploration.
Co-ops had always been embraced by progressive thinkers, and now that progressive thinking was becoming more mainstream, co-ops were too. In Madison, students and non-students alike were busy setting up a cooperative economy as an alternative to the capitalist economy, which they felt had led to inequality, a denuded environment, and the country's involvement in the Vietnam War.
But people, I think, consciousnesses were really raised at that time to the problems of economic justice. And that's basically what attracted me to cooperative living and the food co-ops.
Was very much in my mind, that was the way to do things, and it was real valuable to work at, setting up structures so that we could do things the way we thought they should be, not just criticize other people who were doing them wrong, although you got to do that too,
right.
But also actually do it right.
Mifflin Street Grocery Co-op was formed in the Mifflin Street neighborhood, the center of rebellion for the student movements.
There's a lot of support for starting, and keeping going these little restaurants, the Willie Street Co-op. There's a place called Whole Earth Foods on Johnson Street. The co-op community was large. We bought our bikes at Yellow Jersey. We went to the co-op garage. We really were within a large, much larger community. It was dispersed, but you could have had your own little city, your own little small town with all of the people who were part of the Common Market, grocery co-op, and starting Willie Street and Mifflin Street and all the food co-ops and the restaurants and there was a place called Good Karma that had some of the best jazz in Madison.
Their food co-ops were blossoming at that time. There was not only Mifflin Street, but Willie Street probably got started in the early 70s. A group of us from over in the near west side organized the Common Market Food Co-op.
In 1969, 3 houses were rented at 10, 22, and 222 Langdon from fraternities, and co-ops were established. Some refugees of the recently dissolved Rust and Schreiner co-ops rented a house at 636 Langdon to start Le Chateau co-op.
It's sort of interesting to see the thing expand, because it was a little bit, well, Stone Manor succeeded. They got that property, and I think that may have been the first of the sort of new wave of co-ops. And then the next year or so, they got Marvin Gardens. I mean, the name came directly off the Monopoly board, because the 2 houses were together at the bottom of Lake Lawn Place. And so you started to have this image of this expanding, just like picking up pieces on a Monopoly board.
The bombing of the Army Math Research Building on campus happened in 1970, and as a result, campus activism became less confrontational. People began to look more and more to living the revolution rather than living for it.
Even though, Saigon had not yet fallen, the anti-war movement was pretty quiet. Some of that impetus towards co-ops was going in other directions, into some of these community organizations that people were involved in from Nottingham.
Some of what was going on in the 60s and 70s was what really was sort of a cultural revolution, and I think a lot of young people, both in universities and in the communities that gathered around universities, were simply reacting, on the one hand, very negatively to what they perceived going on in this society, with its crassness, its commercialness, its individualism, its competitiveness, and wanted to create something that was more human, more humane.
The Vietnam War continued, though, and despite the fact that many students dropped out and left town, or went back to the land, more radicalized people kept coming to the campus to replace them. Madison real estate was like a battlefield at that time. Tenants were organizing against dishonest and greedy landlords, while the city continued to confiscate property by eminent domain to make way for the new vision of Madison it had, one of parking lots, hotels, and university buildings. Some co-ops that had been renting had their houses sold out from under them. Amidst this battle, co-opers began to realize that if their cooperative economy was to have any permanence and self-determination, it would need to buy its own property. They also thought that if they could take property off the speculative real estate market and convert it to co-ops, people would never again have to pay profits to a landlord to live there.